The midnight blue silk of the gown felt like a second skin, heavy and deceptively soft, clinging to the curves of my hips with a fluid grace that mocked my actual intent. It was a masterpiece of deception. To any observer peering through the crystal chandeliers of the Morty estate, I was merely another socialite, a ghost in a mask, a woman whose only concern was the vintage of the champagne in her hand. They wouldn't see the micro tools tucked into the hidden thigh holster beneath the silk. They wouldn't see the way my heart beat a steady, rhythmic cadence against my ribs, a soldier's pulse, unhurried and cold. The air in the grand ballroom was thick, cloying with the scent of expensive lilies, aged bourbon, and the metallic tang of too many people breathing the same filtered oxygen. It was a sensory overload designed to distract, a gilded cage of sound and light. The orchestra played something sweeping and melancholic, the violins weeping under the weight of a waltz that felt more like a funeral march. I adjusted my lace mask, the delicate filigree pressing against my cheekbones. Through the eye slits, the world was fragmented, a mosaic of gold leaf and shadows. "You look like you're searching for something, Alina," a voice murmured near my ear. I didn't flinch. A professional doesn't flinch. I turned my head just enough to offer a practiced, enigmatic smile to the man beside me. He was a minor associate of the Valenti family, a man whose name I had memorized 3 days ago during a reconnaissance sweep of the local social registries. "In a room this beautiful, isn't everyone searching for something?" I replied, my voice a low, sultry purr that I had spent weeks perfecting in front of a mirror. "True," he said, his gaze lingering a second too long on the neckline of my dress. "But some search for pleasure, and others search for secrets. Be careful which one you find tonight. The Mortys don't like their secrets disturbed." "I'm not interested in secrets," I lied, taking a sip of the champagne. It was crisp, cold, and tasted of nothing but vanity. "I just find the architecture fascinating." "Then you'll enjoy the West Wing," he said, nodding toward the darkened corridor that led away from the warmth of the ballroom. "The private quarters are where the real art is kept." "Thank you for the tip," I said, stepping away before he could ask for my name or my number. I moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a predator in a sheepfold. Every step was calculated. I knew the blind spots of the security cameras by heart. I had studied the patrol patterns of the Morty guards from the thermal footage I'd intercepted a week prior. They moved in 12-minute intervals, a rhythmic rotation that left a 3-minute window of vulnerability every hour. The transition from the ballroom to the hallway was a descent into silence. The roar of the gala faded into a muffled hum, replaced by the rhythmic click-clack of my heels on the polished marble. The air grew cooler here, the scent of lilies replaced by the sterile, sharp aroma of lemon polish and old wood. I reached the heavy mahogany doors of the West Wing. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the sudden, sharp clarity that comes when the mission truly begins. This was the precipice. If I failed here, if I tripped a single silent alarm or misread a single biometric sensor, I wouldn't just be arrested. I would be a ghost. And Leo. I pushed the thought of my brother into a dark corner of my mind. I couldn't afford the luxury of guilt. Not when his life was balanced on the edge of a knife I was currently holding. The hallway was lined with Renaissance portraits, stern men with eyes that seemed to follow my every move. I ignored them. I wasn't here for the history, I was here for the ledger. The micro-encrypted drive that held the truth about the syndicate's missing funds, the truth that would either clear Leo's name or serve as his death warrant. I reached the door to the private study. It was a massive, imposing thing of dark oak, reinforced with steel. There was no keyhole, no visible handle mechanism. Just a sleek, black panel integrated into the wood, a biometric scanner. I knelt beside the door, the silk of my dress pooling around me like a dark shadow on the floor. To a passerby, I might look like a woman who had lost her balance, perhaps a bit too much champagne. In reality, I was deploying the bypass kit. I pulled a small, handheld device from my thigh holster. It was a custom-built electromagnetic pulse injector, designed to mimic the specific frequency of the Morty security system without triggering the hardwired alarm. My fingers, gloved in sheer lace that hid my steady touch, worked with surgical precision. The device hummed, a vibration so low it was felt rather than heard. I held my breath, watching the small LED readout on the screen. The sensor was resisting. It was a high-end model, something designed by a firm that specialized in military-grade encryption. "Come on," I whispered, the words lost in the vastness of the hallway. I pulled out a thin, translucent film, a synthetic skin I'd engineered to mimic the thermal heat signature of a human hand. I pressed it against the scanner, my own hand steadying the device. I felt the heat from the injector transferring to the film. The scanner pulsed a soft, rhythmic blue. Wait, a shadow flickered at the end of the hallway. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I pressed my body against the wall, the silk of my dress feeling suddenly too loud, too bright, too visible. A guard. He was walking the perimeter, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. He wasn't looking my way, but he was close. Too close. I could hear the faint jingle of his keys, the rustle of his uniform. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a god I didn't believe in that the darkness of the hallway would be enough. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps grew louder, then began to fade. He was moving toward the ballroom. I exhaled a long, slow breath that felt like it had been trapped in my lungs for an eternity. My hands were shaking, just a fraction. I forced them still. I couldn't afford a tremor. A tremor was a mistake. A mistake was a grave. I returned my focus to the scanner. The blue light had turned to a steady, expectant amber. Almost there, I breathed. I applied the final layer of the bypass, a microfilament wire that would bridge the gap between the scanner's logic board and my injector. It was a delicate operation, akin to threading a needle in the middle of a thunderstorm. The amber light flickered. A soft, mechanical whirring sound emanated from within the door. The heavy steel bolts began to retract, the sound muffled by the thick wood but unmistakable to my ears. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The door didn't swing open. It gave a heavy, final thud as the latch released, leaving it ajar by a mere fraction of an inch. I pushed it open, slipping into the darkness of the study. The room was vast, smelling of old paper, expensive leather, and the faint, lingering scent of tobacco. It was a sanctuary of power. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that had likely never been read. A massive desk of polished mahogany sat in the center of the room, illuminated by a single, green-shaded lamp. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I had a pair of night vision contact lenses that turned the world into a landscape of varying shades of green. I moved toward the desk, my movements fluid and silent. The silk of my dress hissed softly against the carpet, a sound I tried to minimize by stepping carefully on the edges of the rug. The desk was a fortress in itself. A small, recessed compartment sat beneath the surface, accessible only through a secondary biometric lock. This was it, the drive. I reached into my kit and pulled out a set of precision picks. These weren't standard tools, they were made of a specialized alloy designed to bypass magnetic tumblers. I knelt before the desk, the coldness of the floor seeping through the silk. I could feel the adrenaline beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. This was the moment of truth. The lock was intricate, a labyrinth of pins and springs that felt almost alive under my touch. I worked with a rhythmic intensity, my fingers dancing through the mechanism. Click, click, click. The sound was rhythmic, a metallic heartbeat in the silence of the room. Each click was a small victory, a step closer to the prize. My brow was damp with sweat, but I didn't allow myself to wipe it away. I couldn't lose my grip. The tension in my shoulders was immense, a coiled spring waiting to snap. I focused entirely on the sensation in my fingertips, the subtle resistance of the pins, the way the tension wrench felt against the core. A pin set. Click. Another. I was sweating now, the heat of the room feeling stifling despite the chill. I could hear the distant music from the ballroom, a ghostly reminder of the world I had left behind. It felt like a different reality, a dream from which I was slowly waking. Click, click. The final tumbler groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very wood of the desk. I held my breath, my heart skipping a beat. The compartment popped open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. I reached inside, my fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out, a small, silver microdrive, no larger than a fingernail. It felt impossibly heavy in my palm, a tiny anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I stared at it for a second, the green light of my contacts making it glow like an emerald. "Got you," I whispered. But the victory was short-lived. A sudden, sharp realization hit me. I hadn't checked the secondary security layer. Most of Dante Morty's private rooms were equipped with weight-sensitive floor plates in addition to the biometric locks. I froze, my foot hovering just above the carpet. I looked down. The area around the desk was covered in a thin, nearly invisible layer of fine, white powder, talcum, used to reveal disturbed patterns. The powder was undisturbed, but that didn't mean I was safe. It just meant the sensors were more sophisticated than a simple pressure plate. I needed to get out. Now, I carefully placed the drive into a padded pouch in my thigh holster. I began to back away from the desk, my eyes scanning the room for the quickest exit. The window. Too high and the glass was likely reinforced. The door, I had already bypassed it, but I didn't know if the bypass would hold once the door was fully closed. I turned toward the door, my heart rate climbing again. As I reached the threshold, a sound froze me in my tracks. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't the music. It was the sound of a heavy, leather-bound book being closed. It came from the corner of the room, the shadows so thick they seemed to have substance. I turned my head, my night vision scanning the darkness. A silhouette emerged from the gloom. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a terrifying, predatory grace. The light from the green lamp caught the edge of a sharp jawline and the glint of a silver ring on a large, heavy hand. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, as if the stranger had inhaled all the oxygen. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't have one that could stop a man like that. I simply stood there, my breath hitching in my throat, the midnight blue silk of my dress feeling like a shroud. The man stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing a mask. His face was a mask of its own, composed, cold, and devastatingly handsome in a way that felt dangerous. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "You're a long way from the ballroom, little thief," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rumble, like distant thunder. My mind raced, searching for a lie, a way out, a way to turn this into a misunderstanding. But there was no lying to a man who looked like he owned the very shadows I was hiding in. I lost my way," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. It was a pathetic lie, but it was all I had. The man took a step toward me. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving me every chance to run, yet I found myself rooted to the spot. The sheer gravity of his presence was overwhelming. "Lost your way?" He tilted his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Or did you find exactly what you were looking for?" He gestured toward the desk, toward the empty compartment. "The drive," he said, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "It's a very beautiful piece of technology, almost as beautiful as the woman who stole it." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. He knew, he had known the whole time. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my eyes narrowing. I tried to channel the icy resolve that had carried me through a dozen other infiltrations. "I'm just a guest at this gala." "A guest," he repeated, the word tasting like a mockery. He was standing only a few feet away now. I could smell him, sandalwood, expensive bourbon, and something darker, something that smelled like old blood and power. A guest who knows how to bypass a Morty biometric lock. A guest who dresses in midnight silk to hide a thief's tools. He reached out, his hand moving toward my face. I flinched, but he didn't touch me. Instead, his fingers brushed the edge of my lace mask, tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was electric, a searing heat that made my skin crawl and my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You have talent," he whispered, leaning down so his breath fanned against my ear. "Dangerous, beautiful talent. It would be a shame to waste it on petty theft." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you want?" He pulled back, his eyes searching mine, looking for a crack in my armor. "I want to see what else you're capable of." Before I could respond, a sudden noise erupted from the hallway, the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots. The guards, they were coming. "Hide," he commanded, his voice dropping to a sharp, authoritative whisper. "What?" "Hide or they will kill you where you stand," he said, his grip on my arm tightening just enough to be felt, but not enough to bruise. "And I am not finished with you yet." He shoved me toward a heavy velvet curtain that draped over a large alcove in the corner of the room. I stumbled, the silk of my dress catching on the floor, but I managed to pull myself behind the fabric just as the study doors swung open. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I peered through a tiny gap in the velvet, my breath held tight in my chest. The man Dante Morty, I realized with a jolt of terror, stood in the center of the room, his expression unreadable. Two guards entered, their faces grim under the light of their tactical flashlights. "Sir?" one of them asked, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "We detected a breach in the West Wing security. We thought." "It was nothing," Dante said, his voice smooth and effortless. He walked toward the desk, his movements calm. "A momentary glitch in the biometric sensor. I've already had it looked at." "Are you sure, Mr. Morty?" The alarm triggered a silent alert on the main console. Dante turned to face the guard, his eyes narrowing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "I am sure. Now get back to your post. I don't pay you to investigate ghosts." The guards hesitated, their eyes scanning the room, passing dangerously close to my hiding spot. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to the shadows. "Yes, sir, my apologies." They turned and exited, the heavy doors clicking shut behind them. I waited. I waited for a minute, then two, my muscles aching from the tension. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Finally, I ventured a glance through the curtain. Dante was still standing by the desk. He wasn't looking at the ledger or the compartment. He was looking directly at the velvet curtain. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "You can come out now, Alina," he said. I froze, he knew my name. I stepped out from behind the curtain, my head held high, even as my insides felt like they were turning to ash. I wouldn't let him see me break. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "How do you know my name?" I demanded, my voice cold and sharp. He walked toward me, his gaze never leaving mine. Every step he took felt like a countdown. "I make it my business to know the names of everyone who enters my home," he said, stopping just inches from me. "Especially those who come with such intent." He reached out, his hand settling on my waist. The heat of his palm through the silk was overwhelming, a physical weight that seemed to pull me toward him. "You're a very brave woman, Alina," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "But bravery is a poor substitute for intelligence." I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. It wasn't a violent movement, but it was absolute. I was trapped, caught in the orbit of a man who didn't just break rules, he rewrote them. "What are you going to do with me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He leaned in closer, his face so near mine that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. The scent of sandalwood and bourbon was intoxicating, a sensory trap that made my head swim. "I think," he said, his eyes dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second, "that we have a great deal to discuss." The weight of the situation settled over me, heavy and undeniable. I had come here to steal a secret, to save my brother, to fight a war. But as I looked into the eyes of the man who had caught me, I realized the war had only just begun. And I was no longer the hunter. The lock yielded with a heavy, final thud. The air in the private terrace was different from the stifling, perfume-choked atmosphere of the ballroom. Here, high above the manicured gardens of the Morty estate, the night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. It was a deceptive freshness. The silence of the terrace felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Dante hadn't taken me to a cell. He hadn't even taken me to a holding room. Instead, he had led me through a labyrinth of service corridors and hidden staircases, his hand a constant, burning pressure against the small of my back, before emerging onto this secluded balcony. The gala continued below, a distant, muffled hum of music and laughter that felt like it belonged to another life. I stood at the stone balustrade, my knuckles white as I gripped the cool marble. The midnight blue silk of my dress, which had felt like armor in the study, now felt like a target. I could feel his eyes on me, not the frantic, hungry eyes of the Valenti associate, but a heavy, analytical gaze that seemed to strip away my layers of deception one by one. "You're trembling," Dante observed. He was leaning against a stone pillar, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. The moonlight caught the sharp, lethal lines of his profile, casting half his face into shadow. "It's the cold," I lied. My voice sounded thin to my own ears. "Is it?" He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "Or is it the realization that the game has changed? You entered this house as a player, Alina, but you forgot that I own the board." I turned to face him, forcing my spine to straighten. "I didn't come here to play games, Dante. I came for what was stolen from my family." He let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated in the space between us. "Stolen? That's a very dramatic way to describe a retrieval mission. You didn't come for justice. You came for leverage." "Leverage is the only currency that matters in your world," I snapped. "And right now, I'm broke. Which makes me dangerous." Dante set his glass down on a small iron table and began to walk toward me. His movements were slow, predatory. He didn't stop until he was deep within my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. The scent of him, that intoxicating mix of sandalwood and bourbon, swirled around me, making my senses reel. "Dangerous is an understatement," he murmured. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw, a gesture that was terrifyingly tender. "A woman with your talents usually ends up in a cage or a grave. You've spent your life breaking into places you don't belong. You've lived in the shadows so long, you've forgotten how to stand in the light." "The light is where people get shot," I whispered. His hand slid from my jaw to the nape of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through me, a treacherous, unwanted spark of attraction that I fought to suppress. "Then perhaps you need someone to teach you how to navigate the shadows, without tripping over your own feet." Before I could retort, the sound of heavy footsteps approached the terrace doors. "Dante?" It was a man's voice, harsh, impatient. "The Valenti associates are asking questions about the guest list. They noticed the discrepancy in the West Wing logs." Dante didn't pull away immediately. He lingered for a heartbeat, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Then, with a seamless transition that made my stomach flip, he turned toward the door. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice losing its intimacy and hardening into the tone of a commander. "I'm not your prisoner," I hissed, though we both knew it was a lie. "Tonight, you are," he said, his gaze flickering back to me one last time. "And if you want to keep breathing, you'll play the part I give you." The doors swung open, and a man I recognized as Morty's primary lieutenant, a scarred, hulking man named Marco, stepped onto the terrace. He looked between Dante and me, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Is there a problem, boss?" Marco asked, his hand resting instinctively on the holster at his hip. Dante didn't miss a beat. He stepped toward me, sliding his arm around my waist and pulling me flush against his side. The sudden intimacy was jarring. My breath hitched, and I could feel the heat of his body through the thin silk of my gown. "No problem, Marco," Dante said, his voice smooth and laced with a practiced nonchalance. "Just a misunderstanding. This is Alina. She's a friend of the family." She got a little lost looking for the powder room, and I thought she might need a guide to find her way back to the ballroom. Marco's eyes raked over me, lingering on the way my hand was resting, perhaps too naturally, on Dante's chest. "A friend? I don't recall seeing her on the list." "She's a private guest," Dante said, his grip on my waist tightening slightly. It was a warning, play along. "And she's quite fond of the view, aren't you, darling?" He leaned down, his lips brushing my temple in a gesture that was ostensibly affectionate but felt like a brand. I forced a small, breathless laugh, the sound feeling entirely foreign in my throat. "The view is breathtaking," I said, leaning into him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I'm so sorry for the intrusion. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Marco grunted, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't push further. Dante was the law in this house, and his word was absolute. "Fine, but keep her away from the West Wing. We have enough security headaches tonight." "Consider it handled," Dante said. As Marco retreated back into the ballroom, the tension on the terrace didn't dissipate, it merely transformed. The threat of discovery had passed, but the proximity to Dante was a different kind of danger altogether. He didn't let go of me. Instead, he pulled me deeper into the shadows of the alcove, away from the view of the doors. "You're a very good actress," he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. "I've had practice," I replied, trying to pull back, but he wouldn't allow it. "The Valenti men are looking for a scapegoat," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "They know something happened in the study. They don't know who, but they know someone was there. If they find you, they won't ask questions. They'll just start shooting." I realized then that he wasn't just protecting me. He was using me as a shield, a way to navigate the political minefield of the Gala. "Why help me? You could have handed me over to Marco. You could have ended this right now." Dante leaned down, his face inches from mine. The amber light from the ballroom spilled across his features, emphasizing the predatory sharpness of his eyes. "Because, Alina, you aren't just a common thief, you're a specialist, and I find myself in need of a specialist." "I don't work for the Mortys," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "You don't have a choice," he countered. "You have something of mine, and in return, I have something you need." My heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play coy. It doesn't suit you," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device, a digital interface that looked remarkably similar to the one I had used to bypass the study lock. "You think you're the only one who knows how to navigate the digital architecture of this estate? I've been watching you since you stepped onto the grounds, Alina. I saw the way you moved, the way you scanned the cameras. You were good, but you weren't invisible." A cold wave of realization washed over me. He hadn't been caught off guard in the study. He had been waiting for me. The entire infiltration, the bypass, the thrill of the theft, it had all been a choreographed dance, and he had been the conductor. "You lured me here," I whispered, the horror of it sinking in. "I provided an opportunity," he corrected. "A way for you to prove your worth. And you did. You're efficient, precise, and remarkably calm under pressure." "And what do you want in return for my worth?" I demanded. "I want the ledger. I want the names of the people who framed Leo. I want him cleared." Dante's expression softened, but only slightly. It was a flicker of something that might have been empathy, but in a man like him, it felt more like calculated interest. "Leo, so that's the real prize. The little brother who got caught in the crossfire of a syndicate war." I felt a surge of fury. "Don't you dare speak his name." "Why not? He's the reason you're risking your life tonight," Dante said. He stepped even closer, his body a wall of heat that seemed to trap me against the stone. "He's a bright boy, a little too ambitious for his own good. He thought he could play with the big boys, and now he's paying the price." "He didn't do anything wrong," I shouted, the sound muffled by the heavy velvet curtains. "He was framed." "Framed or not, the evidence says otherwise," Dante said. "The missing funds, the encrypted communications. It all points to him, to the Valenti family's attempt to destabilize the Morty holdings by using a proxy." "I can prove it," I said, my voice cracking. "The ledger, it has the real records. It shows the trail of the money. It shows who actually took it." Dante leaned in, his lips brushing my ear, sending a shiver of pure, unadulterated terror, and something else, something darker, down my spine. "Then find it. Prove it. But you won't find it in the study, Alina. That was just a distraction." I stared at him, my mind racing. If the drive I took isn't the ledger, then what is it? He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, the sudden absence of his warmth feeling like a physical blow. He picked up his glass and drained the rest of the bourbon in one long, slow swallow. The gala is winding down, he said, his voice returning to its cool, detached tone. You should return to the ballroom. Act as if nothing happened. If anyone asks, you were with me, enjoying the moonlight. And after tonight? I asked. Dante looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. After tonight, we see if you're as good as you think you are. There's a meeting tomorrow, a meeting between the Morty and Valenti families. It's going to be volatile. If you want to save your brother, you'll need to be there, not as a guest, but as my shadow. I felt the weight of his words, the impossible choice he was laying before me. To save Leo, I would have to embed myself in the very heart of the underworld that had destroyed him. I would have to walk a tightrope over a pit of vipers, guided by the most dangerous man of them all. I'll be there, I said, my voice steadying. Good, he said. He reached out, his hand lingering on my waist for a moment longer than necessary. Don't be late, Alina. I despise tardiness. He turned and walked back toward the terrace doors, leaving me alone in the moonlight. I stood there for a long time, the cold air biting at my skin, my mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. I had come here to be a thief. Now I was being recruited as a spy. The next morning, I didn't go to my hotel. I didn't go to a safe house. I went to the one place I knew I could find information. A small, dimly lit underground club in the city's industrial district, a place where the shadows were deep and the secrets were cheap. I sat in a corner booth, the scent of stale smoke and cheap gin clinging to the air. I had changed out of the midnight blue silk, now wearing a simple black leather jacket and jeans, my hair pulled back in a tight, practical ponytail. I looked like just another face in the crowd, another soul lost in the city's grime. I was waiting for a contact, a man named Silas, a low-level information broker who dealt in the scraps of the syndicate's movements. He was unreliable, but he was fast. You're looking for something specific, aren't you? I didn't look up, I knew the voice. It was Silas, a man who sounded like he had swallowed a handful of gravel. He slid into the booth opposite me, his eyes darting around the room. I'm looking for information on the Morty Valenti summit, I said, keeping my voice low. Silas let out a sharp, dry laugh. That's high-level stuff, Alina. Dangerous stuff. You're playing with fire. I'm not afraid of fire, I said, meeting his gaze. Maybe not, but you should be afraid of the people who carry the torches, he whispered, leaning in closer. The summit is tomorrow night. It's being held at the old shipyard, a neutral ground, or so they say, but in this city, neutral ground is just a place where everyone has their guns drawn. Do you know who's attending? Everyone, Silas said, his voice barely audible over the thumping bass of the club's music. The heads of the 5 families, the lieutenants, the enforcers. It's going to be a bloodbath if someone slips up. And the ledger? I asked, my heart racing. Do you know anything about it? Silas hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. The ledger? That's a ghost story, Alina. A myth used to scare the newcomers. No one's actually seen it in years. It exists, I insisted. I know it does. Then you're chasing a shadow, he said, sliding out of the booth. My advice, walk away, go back to your little locksmith jobs. It's safer that way. He disappeared into the crowd before I could respond. I sat there, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Was the ledger a myth? Was I chasing a ghost while my brother's life hung in the balance? I felt a sudden, sharp prick in my neck. I gasped, my hand flying to the spot, but there was nothing there. I tried to stand, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were made of lead. The world began to tilt, the lights of the club blurring into long, distorted streaks of color. You shouldn't have come here, Alina, a voice whispered in my ear. I tried to fight it, to reach for the small knife tucked into my boot, but my muscles wouldn't obey. My vision darkened, the sound of the music fading into a dull, rhythmic thud. As I drifted into unconsciousness, a single thought flashed through my mind. Dante hadn't just been watching me, he had been waiting for me to find him. I woke up in a room that was far too clean, far too quiet. The walls were a soft, neutral gray, and the furniture was modern and minimalist. It looked like a high-end hotel suite, but there were no windows, only a single, heavy door that looked like it was made of reinforced steel. I sat up, my head throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. I was lying on a bed with crisp, white linens. I was still wearing my black leather jacket and jeans, but my boots had been removed. The door opened and Dante stepped in. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, looking every bit the powerful businessman. He carried a tray with a cup of coffee and a small plate of fruit. You're awake, he said, his voice calm and even. Where am I? I demanded, my voice rasping. In a safe house, he replied, setting the tray on a small table beside the bed. One of mine. You were drugged, Alina. Someone didn't want you asking questions in that club. Who of? It doesn't matter, he said, sitting in a chair across from the bed. What matters is that you're safe, for now. I stared at him, the confusion and anger swirling in my chest. Why did you bring me here? Why didn't you just let me wake up in the street? Because you're an asset, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. And I don't like losing my assets. He pushed the tray toward me. Eat, you'll need your strength. The summit is in 6 hours. I'm not going anywhere with you, I said, refusing to touch the food. Dante leaned forward, his expression hardening. You don't have a choice. You can stay here in this gilded cage and wait for the Valenti family to find you and finish what they started. Or you can come with me and we can end this once and for all. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, silver object. It was the microdrive I had stolen from his study. You think this is the ledger? He asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. I stared at the drive, a cold dread beginning to seep into my bones. What is it then? He held it up, the light from the overhead lamp glinting off its metallic surface. This is the key to everything, Alina, but it's not the key to the ledger. He stood up, walking toward the door. I'll be waiting in the car. Don't make me come back in here to fetch you. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the silence of the room. I looked at the coffee, the fruit, the silver drive sitting on the table. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the last 24 hours. The gala, the study, the terrace, the club. It was all part of something much larger, much more sinister than a simple theft. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I picked up the microdrive. It felt cold, unnervingly heavy. I knew I should destroy it. I knew I should run. But I couldn't. Because as long as I held this drive, I had a chance. A chance to save Leo. A chance to tear down the empire that had tried to crush him. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and hot, but it grounded me. I stood up, my legs still a bit shaky, and began to dress. I didn't have much time. As I walked toward the door, I realized that the entanglement wasn't just between me and Dante. It was between me and the very fabric of the world I had tried so hard to escape. I was no longer just an intruder. I was part of the machine. And as I stepped out into the hallway, the weight of the drive in my pocket felt like a promise. You aren't here for the jewels, Alina, you're here for the sins. The interior of the black sedan was a vacuum of sound, insulated against the cacophony of the city by layers of reinforced glass and heavy leather. The rain had begun to fall, a relentless, rhythmic drumming against the roof that felt like the ticking of a countdown. We were moving through the industrial district, the skeletal remains of old warehouses and rusted shipping containers blurring past in the dim light of the street lamps. Dante sat beside me, his presence a silent, suffocating weight. He hadn't spoken since he'd picked me up from the safe house, but I could feel the tension radiating from him, a coiled energy that made the air in the car feel charged. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, watching the droplets race across the glass, each one a tiny, distorted reflection of the world outside. The microdrive sat in my palm, its cold surface a constant reminder of the lie I was carrying. You're thinking about it, Dante said. His voice was low, cutting through the silence without effort. I didn't turn to look at him. Thinking about what? The moment you realize the truth, he said. The moment you realize that everything you believed about this mission was a carefully constructed mirage. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I know the drive isn't the ledger, Dante. I'm not an idiot. No, he agreed, his tone devoid of mockery. But you're a dreamer. You think that by uncovering the truth, you can undo the damage. You think that knowledge is power. But in our world, knowledge is just a different kind of weapon. And sometimes, the only way to survive a weapon is to be the one holding it. The car slowed, turning into a gravel driveway that led toward a massive, windowless concrete structure. The old shipyard, the neutral ground, the slaughterhouse. We're here, he said. The doors were opened by men in dark suits, their faces obscured by the shadows of their brimmed hats. They moved with a synchronized, lethal efficiency that made my skin crawl. I was led through a heavy steel door and into a vast, dimly lit hall. The air here was different. It was thick with the scent of salt, diesel, and the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. At the far end of the hall, a long, heavy table was set. It was surrounded by men with hard eyes and scarred hands, men who looked like they had seen things that would haunt a person's dreams for a lifetime. These were the heads of the 5 families, the architects of the city's shadow empire. Dante led me toward the table, his hand a firm, guiding presence on my waist. As we approached, the low murmur of conversation died away, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Every eye in the room turned toward us, scanning me with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. Morty, a man at the head of the table said. He was older, with hair the color of ash and eyes that looked like they had been carved from flint. This was Lorenzo Valenti, the patriarch of the family that had framed Theo. You're late. A man of my standing is never late, Lorenzo, Dante replied, his voice smooth and dangerous. He simply arrives when the moment is most opportune. He pulled out a chair for me, a gesture that felt both protective and performative. I sat, my heart hammering against my ribs, my eyes darting around the room, cataloging every exit, every potential threat. The meeting was a masterclass in controlled aggression. It wasn't about negotiation, it was about posturing. They traded veiled threats and subtle insults, a dance of power played out in low voices and sharp glances. I sat there, a silent observer, trying to piece together the shifting alliances and the underlying tensions. I realized then that the summit wasn't meant to resolve the conflict between the Mortys and the Valenties. It was meant to decide how the war would be fought. The issue of the missing funds remains unresolved, Lorenzo said, his gaze fixing on Dante. The theft was a direct assault on the stability of our shared interests. We cannot allow a rogue element to operate within our borders. The theft was an inside job, Dante countered, his voice rising slightly. A calculated attempt to destabilize the Morty holdings by using a proxy. We both know who benefited most from the chaos. Are you accusing us, Morty? Lorenzo's voice was a low growl. I am stating a fact, Dante said, and I am prepared to prove it. He looked at me, a silent command in his eyes. I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to produce the drive. He wanted me to reveal the truth. But I knew with a sickening certainty that the truth wouldn't be what he had promised. As the tension in the room reached a breaking point, a sudden, sharp sound erupted from the hallway, the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots. The guards. Dante stood up, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. Stay seated, Alina. The doors swung open, and a group of men entered, led by Marco. They weren't carrying briefcases or documents, they were carrying weapons. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from political tension to imminent violence. The time for talk is over, Marco said, his voice harsh and triumphant. The Valenti family has decided to take matters into their own hands. A chaotic scramble ensued. Men drew weapons, chairs were overturned, and the air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. I dove under the table, my heart racing, my mind screaming for an exit. The world became a blur of flashing lights and the deafening crack of pistols. In the chaos, I felt a hand grab my arm. It was Dante. He pulled me toward a side exit, his movements frantic but controlled. Move, he shouted over the noise. We burst through the door and into a narrow, dimly lit corridor. We ran, the sounds of the battle fading behind us, until we reached a heavy steel door at the end of the hall. Dante kicked it open, and we stumbled into a small, private office. He slammed the door shut and bolted it, his chest heaving. Are you hurt? He asked, his eyes searching mine. I'm fine, I breathed, my voice trembling. But what happened? Why did they attack? The Valenti family knew the summit was a trap, Dante said, his expression grim. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to eliminate the competition. He walked over to a desk and sat down, his face shadowed by the dim light of a single desk lamp. He looked older, more tired, the mask of the powerful businessman momentarily slipping. We need to leave, Dante, I said. Now. Not yet, he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the microdrive. There's something you need to see. I stared at the drive, a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. What is it? He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a small, portable monitor and connected the drive to it. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of files and documents. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the information. It wasn't the ledger. It wasn't the records of the missing funds. It was a digital death warrant. A file, clearly labeled with Leo's name, contained a set of instructions. It was a kill order, detailed and precise, outlining exactly how to eliminate him. It wasn't just a plan, it was a pre-written obituary. I felt the world tilt. The air left my lungs and I slumped against the wall, my head spinning. It's not the ledger, I whispered, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. It's him. I know, Dante said, his voice soft, almost mournful. The drive you stole wasn't a mistake, Alina. It was bait. I knew you would come for it. I knew you would risk everything to get it. I looked up at him, my eyes stinging with tears of fury and betrayal. You used me. You let me believe I could save him, only to show me that you're the one holding the knife. I didn't create the order, Alina, he said, his gaze steady. The Valenti family did. They've had it ready for weeks. I intercepted it. I brought it to you so you would understand the reality of the situation. The reality, I spat. The reality is that you're just as much a part of this as they are. You're playing with people's lives like they're pieces on a board. I am playing the only way I know how to survive, he countered, his voice hardening. The Valenties are going to kill him, Alina. Whether you have that drive or not, they are coming for him. They see him as the loose end that needs to be tied off. "And you?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" Dante stood up and walked toward me. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his presence overwhelming. He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "I want you to choose," he whispered. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. "Choose what?" "The impossible choice," he said. "You can take that drive, run as far as you can, and try to hide him. But they will find him. They have eyes everywhere. And if you run, I will let them. I will step aside and let the machine do what it does best." I felt a sob rise in my throat, but I choked it back. "And the other choice?" "The other choice is to stay," he said, his eyes burning into mine. "To become my partner. To use your skills, your brilliance, to help me dismantle the families that are trying to destroy us. If you stay, if you become my strategist, my wife, I will give Leo total immunity. I will give him a new identity, a new life far away from this world. He will be safe. He will be more than safe. He will be protected by the most powerful empire in the city." I froze. The words felt like a physical blow. "You're asking me to sell my soul," I whispered. "I'm asking you to save your brother," he corrected. "I'm asking you to trade your freedom for his life. It's not a beautiful choice, Alina. It's a brutal one. But it's the only one that ends with him breathing." I looked at the monitor, at the digital death warrant that held my brother's fate in its cold, binary code. I thought of Leo, his bright, ambitious eyes, his laugh, the way he always believed in the best of people. He was so innocent in a world that was so profoundly corrupt. If I ran, he would die. I knew it. I could feel it in my bones. If I stayed, I would lose myself. I would become a part of the very darkness I had spent my life trying to avoid. I would be a queen in a kingdom of monsters, a strategist for a man who dealt in blood and betrayal. I looked at Dante, at the man who was both my captor and my only hope. His face was a mask of absolute certainty, a man who had long ago made his peace with the darkness. "Say yes, and he lives," he whispered, his hand tightening around my waist, pulling me toward him. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled sounds of the battle outside. The weight of the decision was crushing, a physical pressure that threatened to break me. I thought of the midnight blue silk of my dress, a symbol of the woman I had been, a thief, an outsider, a ghost in the shadows. That woman was dead. She had died the moment I realized the truth. I looked into Dante's eyes and I saw the reflection of my own surrender. "Yes," I whispered, the word feeling like a death sentence. Dante didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply pulled me into a hard, crushing embrace, his arms a cage that felt both terrifying and strangely secure. "Then let the war begin," he murmured against my hair. I leaned into him, my eyes closing as the first tear finally escaped. I had made my choice. I had traded my soul for a life. I didn't just sign a contract. I signed my life away. The air in the command center was filtered, cold, and smelled faintly of ozone and high-grade electronics. It was a stark contrast to the heavy, humid tension of the shipyard months ago. Here, there were no velvet curtains or flickering candlelight, only the sterile, blue-white glow of holographic displays and the rhythmic hum of server stacks. I stood before the central tactical map, my fingers hovering just inches above the glass surface. I wasn't wearing silk anymore. The midnight blue dress had been burned, metaphorically and literally, in the fires of my transformation. In its place was a midnight blue tactical bodysuit, a second skin of reinforced Kevlar and smart fabric that felt less like a garment and more like a weapon. It was sleek, lethal, and perfectly engineered for the work I was about to do. "The perimeter is secure, Alina," a voice said behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I knew the cadence of Dante's footsteps, the way he moved through the room like a shadow that had finally found its shape. He was standing by the reinforced glass window that overlooked the city, his silhouette a dark monolith against the sprawling lights of the metropolis below. "Secure is a relative term, Dante," I replied, my eyes fixed on the blinking red icons representing the Valenti stronghold. "They're regrouping. They know we're coming for the vault, and they're reinforcing the secondary gates." "Let them reinforce," he said, turning to face me. He looked different now, not just the polished businessman of the Gala, but a man who had embraced the absolute authority of his position. There was a stillness in him that was more terrifying than his anger had ever been. "They are defending a fortress of sand. They don't realize the tide has already come in." I finally looked at him. We were no longer the thief and the captor, nor were we merely the strategist and the boss. We were the architects of a new order. The alliance we had forged in the blood and betrayal of the shipyard had become the foundation of something much more formidable. "The shipment of the Ledger's physical backups is moving through the North Corridor in 10 minutes, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I was operating in the zone now, that clinical, detached state where my mind functioned like a high-speed processor. If we don't intercept them before they reach the sublevel, the digital footprint won't matter. They'll have the hard copies. Then we don't let them reach the sublevel, Dante said. He walked toward me, stopping just outside my personal space. He didn't touch me, but the gravity of his presence was as palpable as it had been on that first night in the study. Are you ready? I was born ready, I said, though my heart gave a single, sharp thud of anticipation. Not for this, he cautioned, his eyes searching mine. This isn't a heist, Alina. This is a decapitation strike. Once we cross that threshold, there is no going back. The families will never forgive this. They will hunt us until the end of time. They've been hunting us since the day I walked into that gala, I reminded him. The only difference is that now, we're the ones holding the leash. I turned back to the map and swiped a finger across the glass, sending a stream of data to the tactical units positioned around the perimeter. The plan was perfect. It was a masterpiece of infiltration, a symphony of precision that utilized every skill I had honed in the shadows, now amplified by the resources of the Morty Empire. We weren't just breaking in, we were reclaiming. I grabbed my customized sidearm from the table, the weight of it familiar and grounding. I checked the magazine, full, heavy, certain. I slid it into the holster at my thigh, the movement fluid and practiced. Go, Dante commanded. I moved. The infiltration of the Valenti headquarters was a descent into a nightmare of concrete and steel. Unlike the Morty estate, there was no elegance here, no art, no history. This was a fortress built on pure, unadulterated fear. I moved through the ventilation shafts first, my body contorted in the cramped, dark spaces. The sound of my own breathing was loud in my ears, a steady, controlled rhythm. I could hear the guards below, the heavy thud of boots, the low murmur of voices, the occasional clatter of a weapon being checked. I dropped from the ceiling into a secondary maintenance corridor, landing silently on the balls of my feet. The red strobe of the emergency lights, triggered by my initial breach of the outer perimeter, painted the walls in rhythmic, bloody flashes. It felt like being inside a heartbeat. I moved like a ghost through the shadows, my tactical suit absorbing the dim light. I bypassed the first security checkpoint by looping the camera feed, a trick I'd mastered years ago, but now executed with a level of sophistication that would have made my younger self weep with envy. I reached the heavy, reinforced doors of the main vault room. This was it, the heart of the Valenti Empire. The place where the secrets were kept, the physical evidence of every sin they had committed against the city and against my family. I pulled a specialized decryption tool from my belt. It was a device of my own design, a piece of technology that bridged the gap between digital hacking and physical manipulation. I pressed it against the keypad, and the device began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my teeth. Click, click, click. The sound was different this time. It wasn't the rhythmic tension of a locksmith's tool. It was the heavy, mechanical groan of a high-security system being dismantled by a superior intelligence. The doors hissed open. I stepped into the vault, the air inside stale and freezing. The room was filled with rows of steel cabinets and heavy, locked crates. In the center, on a raised pedestal, sat the target, the primary encrypted drive containing the physical backups of the ledger. I reached for it, my fingers inches from the cold metal. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Alina. I froze. The voice came from the shadows at the back of the vault. Lorenzo Valenti stepped into the light. He looked older, more haggard than he had at the summit, but his eyes still held that same, flinty cruelty. He wasn't alone. 4 of his top enforcers stood behind him, their weapons leveled directly at my chest. "You've caused a lot of trouble for a little girl," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, rasping growl. "You thought you could come into my house and take what belongs to me." I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I kept my hand near my sidearm, my mind calculating the angles, the distances, the milliseconds of reaction time. "It was never yours, Lorenzo," I said, my voice steady and cold. "It was stolen, and I'm just returning it to the rightful owners." "The Mortys," Lorenzo laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "They are nothing but scavengers. They live off the scraps we leave behind. You've made a mistake, girl, a fatal one." "The mistake was thinking you could keep the truth buried forever," I countered. "The truth is whatever I say it is," Lorenzo spat. "And right now, the truth is that you're going to die in this vault." He raised his hand, a signal for his men to fire. In that split second, the world slowed down. I didn't think, I reacted. I dove to the left, the first volley of gunfire erupting behind me, the bullets slamming into the steel cabinets with a deafening roar. I rolled, coming up on one knee, and drew my sidearm in a single, fluid motion. I fired 3 shots, precise, controlled, lethal. The first man went down, a crimson spray painting the floor. The second staggered, clutching his shoulder. The room exploded into chaos. The red strobe lights turned the gunfight into a series of disjointed, violent snapshots. I moved through the crossfire, using the heavy crates as cover, my movements a blur of calculated aggression. I wasn't just fighting for my life, I was fighting for the culmination of everything I had become. A bullet grazed my arm, the heat of it searing through the Kevlar, but I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the focus. I fired again, dropping the third enforcer. The fourth man lunged at me, his knife flashing in the red light. I parried his strike with the barrel of my gun, twisted his arm, and drove my elbow into his throat. As he collapsed, I delivered a final, decisive shot. I was alone in the room with Lorenzo. He was backed against the pedestal, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and terror. He held a heavy revolver, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he screamed. "I'll kill you, I'll kill everyone." "You've already killed enough, Lorenzo," I said, stepping toward him. My breathing was heavy, but my hands were steady. "It ends tonight." "It ends when I say it ends?" He pulled the trigger. The shot was death-inducing in the enclosed space. I ducked, the bullet whistling past my ear and slamming into the pedestal. I didn't wait for him to recover. I lunged forward, closing the distance before he could aim again. I tackled him, the weight of our bodies slamming into the floor. We struggled, a primal, desperate scramble for dominance. He was stronger than he looked, his hands clawing at my face, his teeth baring in a snarl. I felt a sharp pain in my side as his revolver struck me, but I didn't let go. I grabbed his wrist, twisting it with every ounce of strength I possessed, until the gun fell from his grasp. I followed up with a heavy, precise blow to his temple, and then another. He slumped beneath me, unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. I sat there for a moment, my chest heaving, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. I looked at the drive on the pedestal. It was untouched. I reached out and took it. The weight of it was different now. It didn't feel like a burden or a threat. It felt like a trophy. I stood up, my body aching, and wiped a smear of blood from my cheek. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the silent vault. As I emerged from the facility, the rain had stopped, replaced by a pale, gray dawn that was just beginning to break over the city. The sirens were wailing in the distance, a chorus of approaching chaos, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the noise. Black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened and Dante stepped out. He looked at me, at the blood on my suit, the exhaustion in my eyes, and the silver drive in my hand. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and cert. "It's done," I said. "It's just beginning," he replied. We drove away from the ruins of the Valenti Empire, heading toward the heart of the city. As we moved through the waking streets, I looked out the window and thought of Leo. He was safe. He was living a life he never thought possible, protected by the very darkness that had once threatened to consume him. He was free. And because of that, I could finally be free, too. But it wasn't the freedom I had once imagined. It wasn't the freedom of a woman living in the light, untethered and unburdened. It was something deeper, something more complex. It was the freedom of a woman who had mastered the shadows, who had learned to command the very forces that sought to destroy her. I wasn't a thief anymore. I wasn't just a strategist. I was the architect. And as the sun finally crested the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the skyline, I realized that the house I had built was finally, irrevocably, mine. The thief had become the architect, and the house was finally hers.